Hey everyone, this is Jane from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be talking and speculating a bit on, in my opinion, pretty interesting topic about how hobbyists in the West ended up to come to prefer wet stored teas generally. We're going to be talking a lot in generalizations, quite a bit of speculation and guessing on my part. I'm going to try to talk through what I think are the reasons, but it's one of those questions that I don't think you're going to get necessarily a concrete answer, but these are just kind of like my hot takes or my quick thoughts on that. So what do I mean by preferring kind of wetter stored teas? Well, I mean more preferring teas that are not stored like drier, so places like Beijing, Kunming, and preferring kind of like Taiwan, Malaysia, Hong Kong traditional, which is a little different than those two. But I think there is, in my opinion, a fairly clear preference towards those teas, certainly in the Anglosphere of tea drinking, Pu'erh, which is, you know, a part of probably a lot of the people that are following this channel. So one of the questions I'm going to try to answer is that the case, actually? Could that possibly be wrong? Is that kind of the basis of the assertion wrong? I don't think it is, but, you know, it's good to kind of examine those things too. First off, is that true? Well, I think certainly in the Anglosphere, so we're talking like Discord servers, Slack servers, things like that, Reddit, I think there is a clear preference for those. So one thing to be very careful about is, you know, it's very easy to end up in a bubble. And no doubt there are some distinct, interesting cultural practices that you're going to run into in these certain circles that might not be present in other ones. So, for example, you could have Chinese speakers and drinkers that have immigrated here but don't participate in these communities. And perhaps they prefer drier stored tea. So why do I not think that is actually the case? Well, I think the main reason I think that case is basically the different immigration patterns. And this is going to tie in a little bit into some of the video later as well. But the areas that have immigrated to the U.S. and to the West in general are predominantly from areas that prefer kind of like the wetter storage, or at least it makes up a disproportionate amount. For instance, my family, I'm half Chinese, came to the U.S. over 100 years ago at this point from kind of a Cantonese language speaking area. Cantonese speakers in the U.S., which generally come from kind of Guangzhou area, and an area which is heavily associated with kind of wetter stored and traditionally stored Pu'erh, make up a disproportionate amount of immigrants here. Another place that you'll see a lot of people over in the West, compared to kind of the total number of them and kind of the global population, are the Taiwanese. Cantonese, Taiwanese, generally speaking, these people are going to prefer the wetter stored teas. That's just what's there. And that's what you're going to see if you actually travel to those places, and those are the climates. So you could say, okay, maybe there's like kind of a genetic or temperature difference there. I don't actually think that's the case. Generally speaking, our climates here are going to more closely resemble something like northern China, so Beijing. Certainly Seattle would more closely resemble that. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but I think if you were to do a similarity comparison, Seattle is more similar weather-wise to like Shanghai or Beijing than it is to Guangzhou or Hong Kong, something like that. But nevertheless, even despite having that, like kind of that climate difference, you'd be like, okay, well, you have that certain climate, you're going to prefer the drier stored teas. I mean, it's easier to do there, and it's also just like kind of it would match China. But that's not the case. I think in general, even though people exist in kind of like these drier environments, they come to prefer kind of these wetter stored teas that are dominant in more kind of the hotter parts of East Asia. And it's kind of due to this interesting mismatch of climate and preference where we are in a drier and colder climate, but we prefer wetter stored tea. We end up with some really weird and interesting solutions to that. I mean, Pomodores are probably the best case, that you're just not going to see in China. And in fact, if you bring that up to people in East Asia, they tend to think you're weird because, yeah, it is frankly just really unusual because our climate is different, but we prefer it certain ways. Whereas like maybe in northern China, people don't have that same preference. They're actually okay with the tea running a little bit drier. Yeah, so I think that's one reason. I think most places in the U.S. will opt for kind of the harder option. Yeah, so anyways, let's get into a little bit more kind of the positive case here. The West, specifically the U.S., is touched a lot by Toisan immigrants. So more recently, there's more Mandarin-speaking immigrants. A lot of those are Taiwanese. Of course, the immigration patterns are dynamic. They're constantly changing. So you will have certainly some people from other regions there. The Cantonese influence cannot be understated. In the U.S., for instance, I think it's pretty close in terms of Cantonese versus Mandarin speakers. Most of the immigrants that have been here for a while are Cantonese, generally speaking, whereas in China, the Cantonese-speaking population is something like 6%, something around there. So it's much, much lower than it is here. So we're getting a very disproportionate amount of immigrants. I think that could also be one of the reasons why we are kind of being influenced in that certain way. It's people like Marshallin, who is has certain roots in Hong Kong, and people like myself who have taken kind of his lead and things like that. I mean, personally, I just prefer that sort of tea. I've tried plenty of dry sorted teas as well. So yeah, I think it's possible that we are kind of taking the lead of the immigrants that have actually come here, which tend to be kind of coming from these more wetter stored areas. And I think those are the people, if you look at the actual Chinese-speaking people, who have had quite a lot of influence on that. Another possibility is that, like in the West, we're just exposed to a couple of the different views, and it's easy enough to try dry stored tea. A place that is probably the dominant vendor in terms of just volume being done, Yunnan Sourcing, probably sells more dry stored tea than they do other stored tea, and is based in Kunming. So it's possible that maybe we're just exposed to a little bit more, and so we can kind of make our own preference. Certainly not everyone prefers wet stored tea. It's just something that I feel like I have observed is kind of a general preference where people are going to gravitate a little bit away from like the Kunming storage, which tends to get a bad rap. Perhaps undeservedly so in some cases, but who am I to say? Because I do prefer the southern Chinese, like Guangzhou stored tea as well. And how many immigrants are coming here from Kunming? Very, very few. I've met, I think, one person from Yunnan before, whereas, like a huge amount of people in the U.S. Have roots in kind of that Pearl River Delta area or Taiwan. So yeah, those are just some of my quick thoughts on that, where we just have kind of like this outsized influence of people from certain areas that are promoting those sorts of areas. Or the other case I would present is basically that we are able to sample a couple different versions, and the versions, at least that we're getting here in the West, are more persuasive as far as like those southern Chinese ones. That's certainly something that's probably more specific to our specific bubble of the Anglosphere Pu'erh world, which is a very, very niche and specialized place. Okay, so those are kind of some random thoughts. Let me know how you like this video. Let me know if there are some other reasons why you think that people in kind of our bubble have ended up really strongly preferring wet stored tea. But it is one of those interesting things where you're like, that is interesting, just because our climate is so different from what a lot of people tend to prefer. And that's how we end up in these weird spots where we're like, I want to commandeer this fridge and have it unplugged or cut the cord or something and have a bunch of Pu'erh and toss in some cigar packs there to add some humidity. So yeah, it's a very interesting kind of space here. I also am not a big believer in kind of the genetic case where it's like, I don't know what you would say even that, just because like within China, there's a huge difference, and obviously, genetically speaking, within China, it's somewhat similar. It's like northern Chinese versus southern Chinese. It's probably some difference, but there's a lot of Han Chinese, just period. So, I mean, there is a huge, there's a big difference in preference depending on where you are in China for certain sorts of storage. Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.